This is the story of where possession comes from, and why it has remained one of the most enduring ideas in horror films. Long before possession appeared on screen as a violent struggle between demons and the human body, it existed as a way ancient cultures explained illness, fear, and behavior they could not otherwise understand. What modern horror presents as a battle between good and evil is actually the final stage of a belief system shaped over thousands of years by religion, medicine, philosophy, and changing ideas about morality. The version audiences recognize today represents only one interpretation, selected from a much longer and more complex history. To understand how possession became one of horror's most familiar themes, it helps to step away from cinema and return to the earliest records of human belief. Modern horror films tend to portray possession in a very specific way. An external force enters the body, identity begins to fracture, and behavior changes in ways that feel aggressive, disruptive, or dangerous. The possessed individual becomes unpredictable, often unrecognizable to the people around them. This force is almost always framed as malicious. It speaks through the victim, resists authority, and reacts strongly to religious symbols. The body becomes a site of conflict, and the solution is rarely understanding. It is confrontation. Most of these portrayals draw from Christian demonological traditions, particularly those associated with Catholic exorcism. Possession is framed as a moral invasion, and resolution comes through ritual resistance and expulsion. Because this version is so familiar, it often feels timeless. In reality, it reflects a very specific moment in history, shaped by theological concerns rather than ancient belief. Earlier cultures understood possession in very different ways. Before possession became associated with demons and exorcism, it functioned as an explanation for conditions people could not otherwise explain. In early societies, the boundary between the physical, emotional, and spiritual was far less defined. The earliest written accounts resembling possession appear in ancient Mesopotamia, dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. In this context, unexplained illness, emotional distress, or unusual behavior were often attributed to spirits believed to have entered the body. These spirits were not defined by moral evil. They were forces associated with disease and imbalance. When something went wrong, the cause was believed to be intrusion rather than wrongdoing. Cuneiform tablets describe rituals intended to identify the spirit involved and reduce its influence. Priests acted as healers, combining religious authority with early medical practice. What stands out is the response. Possession was treated as a condition that required care and intervention, not punishment. The affected person was not feared, they were helped. Hebrew tradition approaches possession differently. In the Hebrew Bible, spirits that influence human behavior are not portrayed as independent forces acting in opposition to God. Instead, they are described as operating under divine authority. A clear example appears in the book of Samuel, where King Saul is said to be troubled by an evil spirit, described as coming from the Lord. That framing matters because it presents possession as divine displeasure rather than a random or hostile spiritual attack. At this stage, possession becomes tied to morality and obedience. It is no longer neutral, but it still does not resemble the later idea of demonic invasion. There is no elaborate hierarchy of demons and no formal ritual designed specifically to expel a possessing force. Responses include prayer, music, and appeals for divine favor, emphasizing reconciliation rather than confrontation. Greek interpretations expand the idea further. The concept of the daimon referred to a spiritual influence capable of shaping emotion, thought, or behavior without being inherently malicious. Philosophers described possession-like states as inspiration or imbalance. Plato wrote about mania as a form of divine madness, that could produce insight, prophecy, or creativity. At the same time, Greek medical thinkers began questioning spiritual explanations altogether. Texts associated with the Hippocratic tradition argued that many conditions attributed to divine influence had natural causes. In Greece, possession existed at the intersection of religion, philosophy, and medicine, rather than belonging to one explanation alone. When these traditions are placed side by side, a shared pattern emerges. Possession consistently refers to an external influence affecting the human body or mind. What changes is how that influence is interpreted. In Mesopotamia, possession is treated as illness. In Hebrew tradition, it reflects divine authority and moral consequence. In Greek thought, it can signify imbalance, inspiration, or psychological disturbance. What is notably absent in all three is the idea of possession as a purely evil invasion requiring violent removal. That interpretation would emerge much later. This comparison shows that possession was never a single belief. It adapted to the fears, values, and explanatory needs of each culture. To modern audiences, ancient explanations for possession can feel distant or symbolic, but for the people who lived within these belief systems, they were practical and meaningful. Possession provided a way to make sense of experiences that disrupted daily life. Illness, sudden changes in behavior, and emotional distress did not feel random. They demanded explanation. By attributing these experiences to spirits or divine influence, early cultures gave structure to uncertainty. Possession named the problem, explained its cause, and suggested a response. Whether that response involved ritual, prayer, or philosophical reflection, it offered a sense of order. These explanations also removed personal blame. Instead of seeing the affected individual as broken or immoral, possession framed them as influenced by forces beyond their control. That distinction mattered in societies where survival depended on cooperation rather than isolation. As belief systems evolved, so did the explanations, but the function remained the same. Possession was a way to translate fear into meaning. Modern horror preserves this function, even as it changes the explanation. Between the 1st and 5th centuries CE, early Christianity reshaped the idea of possession in a way that permanently altered its meaning. Spiritual influence became moral opposition. Spirits were increasingly categorized as demons aligned against God, and possession was reframed as evidence of spiritual warfare rather than illness or imbalance. As theology developed, demonology became more structured. Possession was no longer something to interpret or treat. It became a threat. During the medieval period, this interpretation intensified. Possession became associated with sin, heresy, and social disorder. Fear replaced care, and suspicion replaced understanding. By this point, the possessed individual was no longer simply afflicted. They were dangerous. This framework would later become the foundation for modern horror's portrayal of possession. By the 19th century, explanations for possession began to shift again, this time toward medicine. Behaviors once attributed to spirits or demons were increasingly examined through physical and psychological frameworks. Conditions such as epilepsy drew particular attention. Seizures could involve convulsions, altered awareness, and uncontrolled speech, all features that closely resembled historical possession accounts. The symptoms did not change. The explanation did. Modern horror largely ignores this transition. Ambiguity weakens conflict, and horror depends on clarity. Instead, films return to the older, more absolute version of possession, where an external force invades the body and must be confronted. Possession remains effective because it reflects a fundamental human fear, the loss of control. Across cultures, Possession explained behavior that felt foreign or frightening. It transformed internal distress into something external and visible. Modern horror preserves this function. The possessed body becomes a symbol of vulnerability and invasion. Audiences recognize the fear, even if the explanation has changed. What ancient cultures described through spirits, horror describes through demons. The anxiety remains the same. Possession did not begin as a horror concept. It began as an explanation. Across ancient cultures, possession described illness, imbalance, divine influence, or inspiration, depending on where and when it appeared. Over time, those explanations shifted through theology, philosophy, and medicine, without ever fully replacing one another. Modern horror reflects none of that complexity. Instead, it selects the most absolute version of possession, where an external force invades the body and must be confronted. Horror did not invent possession. It inherited one interpretation, amplified it, and turned it into spectacle. Once that history is visible, possession on screen no longer feels ancient. It feels chosen.